The courtroom was buzzing with low voices and shuffling papers, the kind of restless energy that always fills the air before a hearing begins. Lawyers whispered to their clients, clerks carried stacks of files, and the bailiff stood stiff near the front, keeping order with his sharp eyes. Everyone seemed busy, everyone seemed important, except for the quiet black woman who stepped through the heavy wooden doors. She walked with calm steps, not hurried, not timid, just steady. Her clothes were neat but simple, nothing flashy that would draw attention. She carried a small folder in her hand and kept her head high, even as a few curious eyes followed her. To most people in that room, she looked like any ordinary citizen walking in alone, without a lawyer by her side, without the confidence of someone who knew the system. People often judged quickly in places like this, and she could already feel their assumptions settling on her like a weight. She found her seat at the defendant's table, setting down her folder carefully. The opposing attorney, a man in an expensive suit with slicked back hair, smirked slightly as he looked at her. To him, she looked unprepared, out of place, an easy target. He leaned toward his client and whispered something that made them both chuckle quietly. Their laughter carried just enough for her to hear, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes forward, her face calm, her breathing steady. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The gavel struck and silence fell across the room. The judge adjusted his glasses as he scanned the papers in front of him, hardly sparing her a glance. When his eyes did land on her, they held impatience, as though he had already decided she would waste his time. The case began, and immediately the imbalance showed. The opposing attorney spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the judge was already on his side. He used complicated legal terms, tossing them into the air like weapons, his voice sharp and polished. He barely acknowledged her presence except to dismiss her points before she even made them. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, her folder in her hand. She spoke clearly, but the judge interrupted within seconds. "Get to the point," he snapped, his tone curt. She tried again, laying out the facts she had carefully prepared, but once more he cut her off, turning instead to the attorney. "What do you have to say to that?" The attorney grinned as if the case were already his. He leaned forward, answering smoothly while the judge nodded along. It was clear to anyone watching, the judge was not interested in her side. Around the room, some people shifted uncomfortably. They could see the imbalance. The woman was speaking with calm, steady logic, but she was being ignored, pushed aside, treated as if her words carried no weight. Some whispered under their breath, others shook their heads, but no one spoke up. This was how things often played out. Power listened to power, and those who looked ordinary were dismissed before they even began. Still, she did not lose her composure. She did not raise her voice or show anger. Instead, she stood patiently, waiting her turn even when it wasn't given to her. Her calmness was striking, though most mistook it for weakness. They didn't know that behind her quiet eyes was a storm waiting to be revealed. The tension in the room grew heavier as the minutes passed. The attorney grew bolder, mocking her arguments, speaking over her with the judge's approval. The judge himself leaned back in his chair, as if the matter was already decided. His pen scratched across his notes, but not in her favor. And through it all, she remained steady. She did not beg. She did not panic. She let them underestimate her. She let them believe she was powerless. The atmosphere of the courtroom was thick with assumptions. Assumptions about her race, her appearance, her lack of a lawyer. Everyone thought they already knew how this story would end. Everyone thought they had already measured her worth. But they were wrong. No one knew that the woman standing silently at the defendant's table was not an ordinary citizen at all. No one knew the depth of her knowledge, the years of experience, or the authority she carried with her. She had walked into that room knowing exactly what kind of welcome she would receive, and she had chosen patience. The tension wasn't just in the case, it was in the way the entire courtroom underestimated her. Every dismissive glance, every impatient word from the judge, every smirk from the opposing attorney was fuel gathering quietly behind her calm eyes. She knew her time would come. And when it did, the shock would ripple through that room like a sudden storm breaking a still sky. For now, she let them believe their own story. For now, she endured the weight of their arrogance. Because the real story hadn't even begun yet. The gavel echoed, and the air inside the courtroom grew heavy. The black woman stood still, hands resting on the folder she had brought with her, ready to present her points. She had come prepared, every page carefully arranged, every fact supported. But almost instantly she realized preparation alone would not matter. From the very beginning, the judge's tone made it clear. He had little patience for her. His eyes narrowed as he glanced her way, not with respect but with mild annoyance, as if she were an interruption in his busy day. He adjusted his robe, leaned back in his chair, and waved a hand in her direction. "State your case quickly," he said, his voice clipped. She nodded politely and began to speak, her words clear and calm. But after only a few sentences, the judge interrupted. "You're wasting time," he muttered. "Get to the point." The opposing attorney smirked, adjusting his tie as he leaned confidently against the polished wooden table. His voice oozed with arrogance when he addressed the court. "Your Honor, it's obvious she doesn't fully understand the law. I don't want to be unfair, but it's clear she's out of her depth here." His words were laced with false politeness, the kind designed to belittle while sounding professional. The judge chuckled lightly, not outright mocking but clearly entertained. "I'll decide that," he said, though his smirk betrayed his agreement. The woman's heart pounded, but her face remained steady. She spoke again, laying out her facts, but the attorney cut her off mid-sentence. "Objection, Your Honor," he said loudly, though there was no real objection to be made. It was a tactic, loud interruptions meant to shake her confidence. "Overruled," the judge said lazily, but instead of letting her continue, he gestured for the attorney to go on. The woman stood silently, forced back into her seat, her words left hanging in the air. The attorney strutted forward, papers in his hand, speaking as if he were giving a lecture. He repeated her points with a mocking twist, turning her logic into something clumsy, laughing under his breath as though the courtroom existed solely for his performance. "See," he said with a smirk, looking at the judge. "She doesn't know procedure. She doesn't know precedent. She's just guessing." Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. They could see the imbalance. They could hear the calm intelligence in her voice whenever she managed to speak, and they could also hear the arrogance dripping from the attorney's words. But the judge did nothing to protect her. His silence gave permission for the mockery to continue. Every time she tried to clarify, the judge waved his hand impatiently. "Sit down. I've heard enough." Every time she began to explain, the attorney raised his voice, drowning her out with exaggerated sighs and sharp interruptions. It was disrespect layered upon disrespect. Yet she did not break. Inside, her chest burned with frustration, but on the outside she remained composed. Her voice never wavered, her expression never cracked. She let them believe they were winning. She let them think their interruptions had silenced her. But beneath that calm surface, her silence was not weakness. It was power building slowly, waiting for the right moment. At one point, the judge leaned toward the attorney and said something with a faint smile, as if they shared a private joke at her expense. The attorney grinned wider, emboldened, and said loudly enough for all to hear, "With respect, Your Honor, this case is hardly worth your time." The woman's eyes flickered up at that moment, meeting his with a calm intensity that made him falter for just a second. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes carried a promise. "You will regret this." Still, the insults continued. She was spoken over, dismissed, treated like someone who had no right to stand in that courtroom at all. It was more than bias, it was arrogance in its purest form. Around the room, whispers began to stir. Some shook their heads at the way she was treated. A few, emboldened by the spectacle, chuckled quietly as though watching a play. To them it was entertainment. To her it was expected. This was not the first time she had been underestimated. This was not the first time her voice had been dismissed before it was heard. But this time would be different. This time, the truth she carried would shatter their arrogance. The disrespect filled the courtroom like smoke, clouding judgment, poisoning fairness. The judge leaned back, already scribbling his decision as though the case was finished before it began. The attorney basked in his own confidence, convinced he had crushed her completely. But the woman remained calm. She had let them write their own story about her. And soon, very soon, she would tear it apart with a single revelation that would change everything. The courtroom carried the weight of imbalance, the air thick with arrogance and dismissal. The attorney leaned back in his chair, smug, certain the case was already his. The judge scribbled on his notepad, not really listening, his pen scratching lazily as though he had already written her fate. The gallery whispered, some pitying her, others entertained by her apparent defeat. And yet, in the middle of it all, she sat still. Her hands rested lightly on her folder, her posture straight, her breathing calm. Where others would have trembled under the weight of such treatment, she remained composed. Inside she felt the sting of their disrespect, but she refused to let it show. She had been underestimated before, countless times, and she knew the power of patience. When the judge waved at her impatiently, she rose again. Her voice, though quiet, carried a steady firmness. "Your Honor," she began, "with respect, I am entitled to present my full statement." The judge sighed. Briefly, he said, his tone sharp. The attorney smirked and leaned toward his client, whispering something that drew a low chuckle. But she ignored it. She opened her folder and began to speak. Her words were not rushed, not clumsy, but clear and precise. She outlined the facts calmly, piece by piece, without a trace of anger in her tone. The judge interrupted again after only a few sentences. "This is irrelevant." She stopped, looked at him and said simply, "It is not irrelevant, Your Honor. It is evidence." Her tone was polite, but it held an edge of quiet authority that made a few in the gallery glance up. The attorney jumped in, raising his voice to overshadow hers. "Your Honor, she's twisting the facts. She doesn't understand the legal framework. I ask that her words be stricken from the record." The judge nodded without thought, scribbling again. But still she did not falter. She waited for the noise to die down, then continued exactly where she had left off, as if nothing had happened. Her calm response was not only in her words, it was in her presence. Every gesture, every pause, every breath carried the weight of someone who knew far more than she allowed others to see. The attorney's interruptions bounced off her like pebbles against stone. The judge's dismissive sighs rolled past her like wind. She held her ground, steady, unwavering. The gallery began to notice. A woman in the back leaned forward, listening more intently. A man near the aisle frowned at the judge's constant interruptions. People began to sense something unusual. This woman was not breaking. She was not folding under pressure. She was carrying herself with a composure that felt practiced. At one point, the attorney tried again to mock her, his tone dripping with condescension. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this lady clearly doesn't understand how the law works. She's wasting valuable time with half-baked arguments." She turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. Her expression didn't shift, her voice didn't rise, but the calmness of her words cut deeper than anger ever could. "Half-baked arguments," she said evenly, "do not frighten me, counsel. And time spent on truth is never wasted." The attorney froze for a moment, caught off guard. He had expected flustered silence or emotional outburst, not a composed, razor-sharp reply. His smirk faltered, and for the first time, a trace of unease flickered across his face. The judge, however, brushed it aside. "Enough," he snapped. "I've heard all I need to hear. Sit down." She did not argue. She closed her folder carefully, placed it on the table, and sat back down. But her eyes remained steady, fixed on the bench. She knew what was coming, a rushed ruling, biased, unjust. And she let it come. Her calm was not submission. It was strategy. She allowed them to underestimate her, to dismiss her, to make their arrogance public for all to see. Every word of disrespect, every interruption, every smirk, they were digging their own grave without realizing it. Around the room the tension shifted. People leaned forward, sensing something beneath her silence. They could not name it yet, but they felt it. She was not an ordinary woman standing alone in court. There was something more, something waiting to be revealed. And so she sat, calm and composed, as the judge prepared to rule against her. She did not panic, she did not beg, she did not plead for fairness. She waited, letting the moment build, letting the weight of their arrogance press harder. Because she knew that when the truth finally came, it would break that arrogance in one devastating blow. The calm before the storm had settled over the courtroom. No one realized it yet, but the storm was coming. The judge adjusted his glasses, leaned back in his chair, and tapped the gavel lightly against the block. The sound echoed through the room, pulling all eyes toward him. His face was stern, but not from deep thought. It was the kind of expression that said the decision had been made long before the arguments were heard. The black woman sat still, her hands folded over her folder, her eyes fixed calmly on the bench. She had seen this look before in other places, in other rooms. The look of someone convinced they already knew her story without listening to a word she had said. After reviewing the arguments, the judge began, his tone sharp and dismissive. "It is clear that the plaintiff has not presented sufficient evidence. The opposing counsel's statements are well-founded. Therefore this court rules." He paused only long enough for the attorney to lean back in his chair, smiling like a man already celebrating his victory. The attorney glanced toward her with smug satisfaction, as if to say, "Better luck next time." The judge continued, "In favor of the defendant." The words landed like heavy stones, but the woman did not move. She didn't gasp, she didn't protest, she didn't even frown. She simply sat, her posture as straight as before, her calm unbroken. To anyone watching, it looked as if she had expected this outcome from the very beginning. Around the courtroom, whispers spread. Some spectators shook their heads in disbelief. They had seen how she was silenced, how her points were brushed aside, how her dignity was chipped away piece by piece. Others whispered their agreement with the ruling, convinced she had been outmatched, that she should never have walked into court alone. The attorney rose quickly, his arrogance on full display. He gathered his papers with exaggerated flair, thanking the judge with a deep, mocking bow. "As always, Your Honor, justice prevails," he said loudly, ensuring everyone in the gallery could hear him. A few laughed quietly, feeding his pride. The judge smirked faintly at the remark but said nothing. He was already reaching for the next case file, eager to move on, eager to dismiss her not only legally but entirely. But she remained still. The silence that followed was strange. Usually, a person in her position would protest, plead for reconsideration, or break down in frustration. But she did none of those things. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, picking up her folder with deliberate care. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor seemed louder than usual, cutting through the smug chatter of the attorney. The judge noticed her calm, almost too calm. He frowned, tapping his pen against the desk. "Is there something else?" he asked impatiently. His tone suggested annoyance, but beneath it was the faintest flicker of curiosity. She met his eyes steadily, unshaken by the gavel, the ruling, or the room full of dismissive stares. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly but firmly. "There is something else." The attorney rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath. "Here we go again. She doesn't know when to quit." The judge sighed. "This case has been decided. I suggest you accept the ruling and move on." Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, one that carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty. "With respect, Your Honor, the case has not been decided." "Not fully. Not yet." The gallery shifted uneasily, sensing something in her tone, something they hadn't felt before. Her calm was no longer just endurance. It carried weight, authority, the kind that didn't beg to be heard but demanded it simply by existing. The judge stiffened slightly, and used to such confidence from someone he had written off. The attorney's smirk wavered, though he quickly tried to cover it with another scoff. "She's stalling, Your Honor. This is beneath the court." But she ignored him completely. She stood tall, her presence filling the courtroom in a way no one had expected. Her silence had built tension, her composure had unsettled them, and now, standing in the shadow of a biased ruling, she was about to break the narrative they had written for her. The judge leaned forward, irritation flickering in his eyes. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" She didn't answer right away. She let the question hang, let the silence grow heavy, let the arrogance of the room collapse under its own weight. Then, in a calm, even voice, she said, "Because I am not just standing here as the accused. I am standing here as a U.S. attorney." Gasps filled the room. The attorney froze mid-step, his papers slipping from his hand and scattering across the floor. The judge's eyes widened behind his glasses, his pen falling from his fingers. The gallery erupted into murmurs, shock rippling through every corner of the courtroom. And in that moment, the biased ruling that had seemed so final only seconds before crumbled into dust. The storm she had been holding back had finally broken. The words lingered in the air like thunder that refused to fade. "I am standing here as a U.S. attorney." The courtroom froze. For a long second no one moved. The judge's mouth hung open slightly, as if the gavel had been pulled from his hand. The opposing attorney's smirk collapsed instantly, replaced by the pale shock of a man who had just realized he had mocked someone far above his rank. The gallery, restless only moments before, erupted into whispers that buzzed through the chamber like electricity. "She's a U.S. attorney?" someone whispered near the back. "Impossible," another voice muttered, though tinged with disbelief. "But she's the one they ruled against?" The bailiff, usually unmoved by drama, blinked and straightened unconsciously, his posture stiffening as respect filled his body. Even he knew what it meant to stand before a U.S. attorney, someone who carried the power of the law itself, someone who could walk into any courtroom in the country and command authority. The attorney stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the papers scattered on the floor. "Why, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking. This is highly irregular. She should have identified herself earlier." "I didn't know." "Enough," the woman said calmly, her voice cutting through his excuses like a blade through silk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The composure with which she stood carried more power than his frantic words. She turned her gaze on him, steady and unshaken. "You didn't care to know. You judged before listening. You assumed before asking. And now you realize the weight of your arrogance." The attorney's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to argue, but her words nailed him to silence. The judge, still flustered, cleared his throat and leaned forward. His face flushed as he fumbled with his glasses. You are a U.S. attorney?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his attempt at authority. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied evenly, pulling out an identification badge from her folder and holding it up for all to see. The golden seal gleamed under the courtroom lights, undeniable proof of who she was. "For years I have served this nation, defending its laws and upholding its justice. And today in this courtroom, I was treated not as an officer of the law, but as someone unworthy of respect." The murmurs grew louder, some gasping openly now. A man near the aisle whispered to his neighbor, "The judge is finished. This will ruin him." The judge's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his papers, suddenly aware of how dangerous his bias had been. He had interrupted her, dismissed her evidence, and ruled against her without thought, all while she carried the weight of federal authority. His chest tightened with shame, but more than that, with fear. She let the silence stretch before continuing. "I did not come here today to wield my title as a shield. I came as a woman seeking fairness, believing that this courtroom would hear me as it hears all people. But instead I was silenced. I was ridiculed. And I was judged not on the strength of my case, but on assumptions about who I am." The attorney shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He had mocked her, cut her off, dismissed her entirely. Now every word she spoke pressed down on him like a weight he could not bear. The judge finally spoke, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "Miss Attorney, But she raised her hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "Do not apologize to me, Your Honor. Apologies mean nothing when justice is not practiced equally. What matters now is that this court understands. Bias has no place in the law. And today you revealed your bias to everyone present." The silence that followed was crushing. Everyone in the gallery felt the truth of her words. The judge lowered his eyes, unable to meet her steady gaze. The attorney sank into his chair, stripped of the arrogance that had once fueled him. This was the turning point. The power dynamic had flipped completely. The woman who had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed now stood as the most commanding figure in the room. The authority of her title, combined with the dignity of her presence, silenced even the loudest voices. People in the gallery began nodding, some whispering words of admiration. "She never broke," someone said, "even when they tried to humiliate her." For the first time since the hearing began, the judge spoke with genuine respect. His voice was careful, almost trembling. "The court will reconsider the evidence," he said, his tone stripped of arrogance. "All arguments will be heard again without interruption." The attorney's face drained of color. He knew what that meant. His so-called victory had been shattered. The case was no longer his to claim. He had not just lost. He had embarrassed himself before a woman whose authority reached far beyond this courtroom. And she, still calm, still steady, sat down again, her folder in her hands. Not triumphant, not gloating, just dignified. She had revealed only what was necessary at the moment when it mattered most. The storm had broken. The courtroom was changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom had never felt so heavy. The judge, who only minutes earlier had sat with the casual arrogance of someone certain of his authority, now found himself shrinking beneath the weight of his own actions. The murmurs in the gallery continued to ripple, each whisper a reminder that what had just unfolded could not be erased. He tried to steady his hands as he shuffled the papers in front of him, but the tremor was impossible to hide. His gavel, once a weapon of dominance, now felt like a hollow piece of wood. He had been exposed, not just as a man who made a poor ruling but as one who had allowed bias to dictate justice. And worse, he had done it in front of someone whose title carried more power than his robe. The judge cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "This court will reconsider the evidence." But the words felt weak even to him. He could feel the eyes of the gallery burning into him, watching not with respect but with judgment. For decades he had held this bench, delivering rulings with confidence. But now, his authority had been fractured, his dignity crumbling under the weight of his own prejudice. His mind raced back over the hearing. The interruptions. The dismissive tone. The moments where he had laughed at the attorney's arrogance instead of shutting it down. The way he had ignored her evidence without even looking at it. Each memory struck him like a blow, and shame rose hot in his chest. The attorney shifted nervously beside his table, still pale and sweating. He had been humiliated too, but the judge's disgrace was far greater. Attorneys could stumble, they could misjudge, but judges were expected to be impartial, to embody fairness. And he had failed in front of everyone. The woman sat silently at her table, not gloating, not smirking, not reveling in the power of her revelation. She simply sat with quiet dignity, her presence radiating calm strength. That silence hurt more than any outburst could have. If she had shouted at him, if she had thrown her title in his face from the very start, he might have felt defensive. But she hadn't. She had given him every chance to be fair. He had chosen arrogance instead. For the first time, the judge saw her clearly, not as just a woman, not as just a defendant, but as a professional, an officer of the law, and most importantly, a human being who had been denied the respect she deserved. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. I fail to grant you the fairness that is owed to every citizen in this court. His words cracked, raw but necessary. I allowed myself to be influenced by assumptions rather than facts. That is not justice. That is not my duty. Gasps stirred in the gallery. A public admission of bias from a judge was rare, almost unheard of. Yet here he was, his face flushed, his voice heavy with remorse. The attorney tried to interject, desperate to salvage something of the case. Your Honor, perhaps we can? Silence, the judge snapped, but the sharpness in his tone was not born of arrogance this time. It was desperation, the urgency of a man trying to salvage what remained of his integrity. You will not speak until you are asked. The attorney sank back into his chair, humiliated, his earlier bravado crushed. The judge turned his gaze back to the woman. His hands, once steady symbols of control, now clutched the edges of his bench. I cannot undo the way you were treated today. But I can acknowledge it. And I can ensure it does not happen again, not in my courtroom, not under my watch. Her eyes met his, calm and unflinching. She did not nod, did not smile, did not absolve him with a gesture. She simply held his gaze, letting the weight of her silence drive the lesson deeper. The judge shifted uncomfortably. In that moment he realized she didn't need his apology. She didn't need validation from him. The dignity she carried was her own, untouched by his failure. His words could not restore what she had already proven. She was stronger than his judgment. And for the first time in his career the judge felt small. Not because of her title, not because of her power, but because she had shown him what true strength looked like. Patience in the face of arrogance, calm in the face of insult, dignity in the face of dismissal. The gallery fell silent again, every eye fixed on the bench. They were watching not just a case but a reckoning. A judge realizing that the robe he wore was not a shield from accountability, but a mirror that reflected his failures back at him. He gripped the gavel, his voice steadying slightly, though still heavy with shame. This court will reopen the case. Every piece of evidence will be heard. Every argument will be considered, without interruption, without prejudice. He paused, then added, softer, as it should have been from the start. The woman gave no outward reaction. She did not need to. Her silence was victory enough. The judge's realization was not for her benefit. It was his burden to carry now. And as he looked at her, sitting tall, calm and composed, he knew he would never forget this day. The day he learned that true authority does not come from a gavel or a robe, but from respect. The day he was humbled not by a title, but by the quiet strength of a woman he had underestimated. The air in the courtroom shifted so dramatically it was almost visible, like the sudden clearing of a storm. Moments ago, the chamber had felt stacked against the black woman, every interruption and smirk feeding an invisible wall of bias. But now, after her revelation and the judge's halting admission, that wall had cracked wide open. The gallery, once restless and half distracted, leaned forward in silence. Eyes that had glanced over her dismissively earlier were now fixed on her with new respect. Some faces showed awe, others shame for having underestimated her too. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a stillness so thick that even the sound of a page turning echoed sharply through the room. At the attorney's table, the man who had mocked her looked as though the ground had been ripped from beneath his feet. His hands fumbled as he gathered his papers, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. His once cocky grin had completely vanished, his face pale and drawn. He avoided her gaze, but the memory of her calm words, "Half-baked arguments do not frighten me, and time spent on truth is never wasted," rang in his ears like a bell he could not silence. The judge, who had always held himself like a figure of unshakable power, sat stiff and subdued. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, not with the respect he was used to, but with scrutiny. For decades, he had presided with unquestioned authority. But today the courtroom belonged to someone else. And that someone sat at the defendant's table, calm and composed, as if she had always known this shift was inevitable. The bailiff, a man who had worked countless trials, subtly straightened in his posture, giving her the kind of deference reserved only for high-ranking officials. He didn't announce it, didn't speak, but his body language said it all. She was not just another defendant. She was power cloaked in dignity. Then came the murmurs, not of mockery but of admiration. "She handled herself better than any lawyer I've seen," a woman whispered near the back. "And she didn't even raise her voice," another replied. "This is the kind of strength that humbles men who think they own the law." The energy in the gallery spread like a tide. People began to look at her differently, not as someone standing on trial, but as someone who embodied the very justice the courtroom was supposed to represent. The attorney, desperate to regain control, stood abruptly. His chair screeched against the floor, startling the quiet. "Your Honor," he began, his voice quivering, "with all due respect, this is highly irregular. She cannot both be a U.S. attorney and a—" "Sit down," the judge barked, his tone sharper than it had been all day. The humiliation in his voice was clear. He was no longer protecting the attorney. Instead, he was scrambling to salvage the dignity of the court. The attorney froze, then sank slowly back into his chair. His shoulders hunched, his earlier bravado gone. He looked like a man who had been stripped bare in front of an audience he could never face again. And still she remained silent. That silence became more powerful than any speech. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to raise her voice or hammer them with accusations. The courtroom itself had transformed around her. The judge's shame, the attorney's collapse, the gallery's awe, everything tilted toward her, as though the weight of truth had finally settled into its rightful place. The judge cleared his throat, speaking in a quieter, more reverent tone. "Ms. Attorney, you may proceed with your case. You will have the court's full attention." This time, there was no impatience, no dismissive wave of the hand. Every word was deliberate, filled with the respect she had been denied earlier. She rose slowly, her folder in hand. The sound of her chair sliding back was the only noise in the chamber, and yet it carried like thunder. When she began to speak, her voice was calm as always, but now it carried a gravity that no one dared to interrupt. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. Her tone wasn't triumphant, but steady, grounded. It was the voice of someone who didn't need to prove her worth, someone who knew the truth was enough. The gallery leaned forward, hanging on to her words. Even the court reporter paused briefly, her fingers hovering over the keys as if reluctant to miss a single phrase. The courtroom had shifted completely. Power, once assumed to belong to the robe and the loudest voice, had revealed itself in patience, dignity, and truth. The woman who had been dismissed and silenced only an hour ago now stood as the undeniable center of the room. The judge was humbled, the attorney undone, the audience transformed. And everyone knew, the final act of this case would not just decide the matter at hand. It would leave a lesson that echoed far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The entire courtroom sat in silence, waiting for her next words. The atmosphere had shifted so completely that it was hard to believe this was the same case that had begun with smirks, interruptions, and dismissive tones. Now every breath, every glance, every heartbeat seemed tuned to her presence. She stood tall, her folder open in her hands, her voice calm but steady enough to carry to the farthest corners of the chamber. "Justice," she began, "is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is the right of every citizen who steps into this courtroom, no matter their appearance, their wealth, or the assumptions made about them." Her words hung heavy, resonating deeply with those listening. Some in the gallery nodded slowly, others blinked hard, as though suddenly aware of their own quiet prejudices. The attorney sat hunched in his chair, staring at his papers but unable to focus. His earlier arrogance felt like a distant memory, replaced by a hollow fear of how history would remember this day. She continued, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "When I walked into this room, I was not seen for who I am. I was interrupted, dismissed, and mocked. Not because of the strength of my case, but because of the assumptions tied to the color of my skin, the simplicity of my clothing, and the silence with which I carried myself. That is not justice. That is not fairness." The judge flinched slightly, each word striking him with the weight of truth. His pen rested still on his desk and used, his eyes lowered. He could not bring himself to meet her gaze, not yet. She drew a deep breath and pressed on. "I did not reveal my title at the start, because I wanted to see whether this courtroom lived up to the principles it claims to uphold. Sadly, it did not. And while I stand here with the authority of a U.S. attorney, I remind you all, every single person who enters this court deserves the same respect, regardless of their title." A hush fell deeper over the gallery. The lesson was clear and it was searing. She was not fighting just for herself anymore, She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked, for those who had been treated as less than human because of prejudice cloaked in formality. The attorney shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed. His arrogance had evaporated completely, leaving behind only guilt and fear. The judge's hands trembled slightly on the bench, the shame of his earlier behavior pressing down harder with every sentence she spoke. Then she closed her folder and placed it gently on the table. Her voice grew quieter but no less powerful. Respect is not something to be given after credentials are revealed. Respect must be the starting point. Because the moment you decide who deserves dignity and who does not, you have already failed the very purpose of justice. The words struck like lightning. A few in the gallery gasped, others sat frozen, their faces etched with realization. One elderly man in the back wiped at his eyes, whispering softly, "She's right. She's absolutely right." The judge finally lifted his gaze, his expression heavy with regret. "You have reminded this court of its true purpose," he said slowly. His voice was not commanding this time, it was humbled, almost reverent. "Justice is not mine to shape as I see fit. It is mine to uphold equally without bias." He turned slightly, addressing the gallery. "Let today serve as a lesson for all who witnessed it. Titles, appearances, assumptions, none of these can decide truth. Only fairness can. Only respect can." His words trembled, but they carried sincerity that had been missing before. The woman inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his attempt to reclaim dignity, though she did not smile. Her expression remained composed, dignified, unchanged. This was not victory for her. It was correction, balance restored, a truth spoken aloud for all to hear. The case would be reconsidered, the evidence re-examined, but the true verdict had already been delivered. The arrogance of bias had been stripped bare, replaced by a lesson no one in that room would ever forget. As the gavel struck, not a soul moved. They sat in silence, reflecting, absorbing, changed. The attorney stared at the floor, the judge's shoulders sagged with humility, and the gallery left one by one, each carrying the weight of what they had just witnessed. And at the center of it all stood the woman, calm, composed, powerful in her silence, proving that dignity, once overlooked, could become the most powerful voice of all. Though the gavel had fallen and the case was set to be reconsidered, the echoes of what had happened in that courtroom did not end with the sound of wood against wood. What took place that day grew far beyond the walls of the chamber. It spread first in whispers among those who were present, then into conversations across the city, and soon after into headlines that reached far beyond. At first, it was just a story people told each other. "Did you hear? A judge ruled against a woman in court, dismissing her like she was nobody." But then, she revealed she was a U.S. attorney. The tale carried shock, disbelief, and admiration. People repeated it with wide eyes and shaking heads. Some said it sounded like fiction. Others said it was the most important reminder of justice they had heard in years. The attorney who had mocked her tried to bury himself in other cases, but the story followed him like a shadow. His colleagues whispered behind his back. His reputation as a sharp-tongued professional had turned sour. Now he was remembered as the man who had mocked a U.S. attorney, who had treated her with arrogance and had been publicly humiliated when the truth surfaced. His clients grew hesitant, and his name became a cautionary tale. Never underestimate the person across the table. The judge's reckoning was far heavier. Though he had admitted his mistake and promised to uphold fairness, the story of his bias reached reporters and legal circles alike. Articles dissected every detail: how quickly he had ruled against her, how dismissive his tone had been, how easily he had aligned with arrogance instead of impartiality. Legal scholars debated whether he should step down. Others argued his public humiliation was punishment enough, as long as it forced him to truly change. But the most important impact was not on the attorney or the judge. It was on the people who heard the story. In barbershops and cafes, in church basements and college classrooms, people spoke of her calm dignity. She didn't raise her voice once, they said. She let them mock her, she let them reveal who they really were. And then, with a single sentence, she turned the entire court upside down. For young women, especially women of color, her story became a symbol. Teachers shared it with their students, telling them, "Do not let the world define you by assumptions. Carry yourself with dignity, and when the time comes, let your truth speak louder than their prejudice." Law students studied the transcript, some in awe of how she handled herself under pressure. Professors used her story as a lesson in ethics, not only about legal strategy but about the moral duty of those who hold power. Bias, they explained, is not just a failure of law but a failure of humanity. And this woman reminded us all what justice is supposed to look like. And for the woman herself, the story changed little about how she lived, but much about how others saw her. She still walked with the same calm, spoke with the same quiet clarity, carried the same dignity she always had. But now, when she entered a courtroom, the silence that followed was not one of dismissal, but of respect. People stood straighter in her presence not because of her title, but because of the lesson they knew she embodied. Years later, when asked about that day, she did not dwell on the humiliation of the attorney or the shame of the judge. She spoke instead about the importance of patience. Sometimes, she said, you must let people underestimate you. You must let them reveal their arrogance, their bias, their prejudice. And when the truth comes, it will not only defend you, it will expose them. That is the power of dignity. Her words were written down, quoted, shared online, painted onto murals. She had become more than just a U.S. attorney. She had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that strength is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes, it is the quiet patience to wait for the right moment, and the courage to let the truth speak when it matters most. In the years that followed, judges across the country began to feel the ripple of her story. Training seminars on bias used her case as an example. Lawyers told their clients about her to remind them never to underestimate an opponent. And ordinary people found in her story the courage to demand respect in places where they had long been overlooked. That courtroom was only one room, one case, one moment. But the lesson that came out of it grew larger than any verdict. It became a part of something greater, a legacy of justice that stretched beyond her, beyond the judge, beyond the attorney. And that was the true ruling, not the one written on paper but the one etched in memory. The ruling that dignity, respect, and equality are not optional. They are the foundation upon which justice must stand. The eternal lesson. Years passed, yet the courtroom moment where a woman revealed herself as a U.S. attorney lived on like a flame that refused to dim. The case itself faded from legal records, tucked away among thousands of others, but the story carried itself forward. It was retold not just as an account of one trial, but as a lesson, a parable, a warning, and an inspiration. In universities, professors repeated her words to new generations of law students. Respect is not given after credentials are revealed. Respect must be the starting point. These lines appeared on classroom walls, on slides during lectures, and even printed in textbooks under sections about ethics and judicial responsibility. For many young students, her name became synonymous with integrity in the face of injustice. Communities remembered her too. In churches and community centers, parents told their children the story. There was a woman who walked into a courtroom and was treated like nothing. They mocked her, silenced her, ruled against her. But she stood tall, and when she spoke her truth, the world stopped. That is what dignity looks like. Children listened wide-eyed, learning that strength wasn't always about shouting louder, but about standing firm until the truth had its moment to shine. Even within the legal system itself, her example lingered. Judges undergoing training on implicit bias were reminded of her case. Court officials were instructed, never assume, never dismiss. Every voice that enters the courtroom must be heard. Her story became a cornerstone for discussions about fairness, cited in conferences and seminars across the country. But perhaps the most powerful echo came in the lives of ordinary people. Women, especially black women who often felt invisible in their workplaces or communities, found strength in her calm defiance. Some carried her words scribbled on scraps of paper in their wallets. Others invoked her story in meetings, in job interviews, in moments when they were underestimated. She became more than a U.S. attorney, she became a symbol of patience, of justice, of quiet strength that could turn arrogance to dust. The attorney who once mocked her lived in the shadow of that day for the rest of his career. He could never shake the story no matter how many cases he won later. His name was tied to her lesson, serving as the cautionary reminder of what arrogance could cost. The judge, humbled and chastened, carried the weight differently. Though his reputation was scarred, he tried to spend his remaining years on the bench making amends, listening more, interrupting less, measuring fairness by equality instead of assumption. He became a quieter man, no longer feared for his sharp tongue but respected for his willingness to admit failure and change. And she carried on her work, never demanding recognition for that one day, never trying to turn her story into personal glory. She did what she had always done, served justice with dignity. But everywhere she went, people already knew. Some approached her shyly to thank her, others stared with quiet admiration, but she never let it swell her pride. To her, the story was never about proving herself. It was about proving what justice should look like. As years turned into decades, the story began to outgrow even her name. It became something larger, a legend retold in schools, in speeches, in articles as if it belonged to everyone. It no longer mattered whether listeners remembered the exact courtroom or the precise case. What mattered was the lesson, that dignity cannot be silenced, that justice is betrayed by arrogance, and that true strength often reveals itself not in force but in patience. And so, long after the gavel struck its final echo, long after she walked out of that courtroom, her presence lingered. Her lesson became eternal. It was carried in the voices of those who demanded respect, in the eyes of children learning to stand tall, in the trembling hands of judges remembering to pause before they ruled, and in the steady silence of anyone underestimated, waiting for their moment to reveal the truth. The world forgot the details of the case, but it never forgot the woman, or the lesson she left behind. Justice, people said, is not blind when bias rules the gavel. Justice is only true when every person is seen. And that was her eternal gift, a reminder that one voice, steady and calm, could transform arrogance into humility and turn a single courtroom into a mirror for the entire world.